The grand ballroom of the Riverside Hotel sparkled under crystal chandeliers. Tonight was different from any other night. The city's wealthiest people had gathered for the annual Children's Hope Foundation Charity Gala. Everyone wore their finest clothes, men in sharp tuxedos and women in elegant evening gowns that probably cost more than most people's cars. At the center of it all stood a magnificent black piano. It wasn't just any piano. This was a Steinway Model D concert grand, the kind that only the world's best concert halls could afford. Its polished surface reflected the warm lights above, making it look almost magical. The evening's star performer had just finished his first set. David Rodriguez was his name, though everyone simply called him the Maestro. He was one of those pianists you see on magazine covers and late-night talk shows. His fingers could make a piano sing in ways that left audiences speechless. Tonight he had played pieces by Mozart and Beethoven so beautifully that some people in the crowd had actual tears in their eyes. During the intermission, David stepped away from the piano and walked into the crowd. He loved these moments almost as much as performing itself. People would come up to him, shake his hand, and tell him how wonderful his music was. It made him feel important, special, like he was exactly where he belonged in the world. "That was absolutely incredible," said Mrs. Patterson, the wife of a famous businessman. She held a glass of champagne in one hand and clutched David's arm with the other. "I've never heard Moonlight Sonata played so beautifully." David smiled his practiced smile. "Thank you so much. Music is my life, and sharing it with people like you makes every hour of practice worth it." As he moved through the crowd, accepting praise and shaking hands, his eyes wandered around the room. Most of the guests were clustered in small groups, talking and laughing. Some stood near the appetizer tables, others by the bar. Everyone seemed to be having a wonderful time. But then he noticed something that struck him as odd. Near the back corner of the room, close to where the piano sat, there was a woman sitting all by herself. She looked to be in her early 50s with graying hair pulled back in a simple style. Her dress was nice but not expensive like the others. She wasn't talking to anyone, wasn't holding a drink, wasn't even looking around the room like most people do at parties. Instead, she was staring at the piano. Not just looking at it, but really staring. Like she was seeing something that no one else could see. There was something about the way she sat there so still and focused that made David curious. "Who is that woman over there?" he asked Mrs. Patterson, pointing discreetly toward the corner. Mrs. Patterson squinted in that direction. "Oh, I have no idea. Probably someone's guest. You know how these charity events work. People buy tables and bring friends to fill the seats." David nodded, but something about the woman bothered him. Not bothered in a bad way exactly, but there was something different about her. While everyone else at the gala seemed impressed by the fancy surroundings and excited to be there, she looked almost sad. Like being in this room with this beautiful piano was somehow painful for her. As the evening went on, David found himself glancing in her direction more and more often. She never moved from her seat. She never got up to get food or drink. She just sat there watching the piano with that same intense expression. The more David looked at her, the more an idea began forming in his mind. It wasn't a particularly kind idea, but it was the sort of thing that happened when someone spends too much time being told how wonderful they are. He started thinking about how funny it would be to put this quiet, sad-looking woman in the spotlight. "Ladies and gentlemen," David suddenly announced, raising his voice so everyone in the ballroom could hear him. The conversation slowly died down as people turned to look at him. "Before I begin my second set, I was wondering if anyone else in the room tonight might like to try playing our beautiful piano here." A few people laughed nervously. These were wealthy donors and business leaders, not musicians. The idea of any of them trying to play after David's professional performance was clearly meant as a joke. David's eyes found the woman in the corner again. She had looked up when he started speaking, and now she was watching him with a careful, guarded expression. "In fact," David continued, his voice carrying that tone that performers use when they're about to do something they think is clever, "I notice we have a lovely lady over there who seems very interested in our piano tonight." He gestured toward the woman, and suddenly every eye in the room was on her. The woman's face went pale, but she didn't look away. There was something in her eyes now that hadn't been there before. Not fear exactly, but a kind of alertness like an animal that suddenly realizes it's being watched. "Would you like to come up and give it a try?" David asked, his smile wide and confident. Don't worry, we're all friends here. No one expects a concert performance. The crowd chuckled at this. Of course, no one expected a real performance. This was clearly just a bit of harmless fun at the expense of someone who probably couldn't play a note. It was the kind of moment that would give everyone something to laugh about later. But as the seconds ticked by, something unexpected happened. The woman didn't shrink back into her chair. She didn't shake her head or wave him away with embarrassment. Instead, she stood up slowly, smoothing down her simple dress. "Thank you," she said quietly, but her voice carried clearly across the now silent room. "I think I would like that very much." David blinked in surprise. This wasn't how these things usually went. Most people would laugh and decline, maybe make a joke about not wanting to embarrass themselves. But this woman was actually walking toward the piano. As she crossed the room, David noticed things about her that he hadn't seen from a distance. The way she walked was different from the other guests. There was a purposefulness to her steps, a kind of confidence that seemed out of place with her quiet demeanor. Her hands, which had been folded in her lap all evening, now swung naturally at her sides. When she reached the piano bench, she paused for just a moment. She looked at the keys, then at David, then back at the keys again. The entire ballroom had gone completely quiet. Even the waiters had stopped moving to watch what would happen next. "Are you sure about this?" David asked, though his tone suggested he was already regretting his little joke. Something about the way the woman was looking at the piano made him uncomfortable. The woman sat down on the bench and adjusted it slightly, moving it just a few inches closer to the keys. Then she placed her hands gently on the piano's fallboard just above the keys and closed her eyes. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm sure." David stepped back, gesturing grandly to the crowd as if he had just introduced the evening's main entertainment. But his smile felt forced now, and there was something in the woman's calm confidence that made him wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. The woman opened her eyes, looked down at the keys, and took a deep breath. The room held its collective breath with her, waiting to see what would happen when her fingers finally touched those black and white keys. What happened next would change everything. The silence in the ballroom was so complete that you could hear the ice cubes shifting in people's drinks. Everyone was staring at the woman sitting at the piano bench. David stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, still wearing that confident smile even though something deep in his gut was telling him this might not go the way he planned. The woman placed her hands on the keys, but she didn't start playing right away. Instead, she just sat there for a moment, feeling the smooth surface of the keys under her fingertips. Her eyes were closed again, and there was something almost peaceful about her expression, like she had found something she had been looking for. Mrs. Patterson whispered to her husband, "This is going to be painful to watch." Other people in the crowd were thinking the same thing. They expected to hear some clunky amateur attempt at a simple song. Maybe Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, or Happy Birthday, something that would make everyone feel embarrassed for her and grateful when it was over. David was already thinking about how he would handle the situation. He would let her play for maybe 30 seconds, then politely thank her and suggest they move on. He was a professional after all. He knew how to handle these awkward moments with grace. But then the woman's fingers moved. The first note that came from the piano wasn't what anyone expected. It was clear, pure, and perfectly pitched. Not the hesitant poke of someone who barely knew where middle C was, but the confident press of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The second note followed, then the third. And suddenly, the room filled with the opening of one of the most beautiful and challenging pieces ever written for piano. It was Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. Not many people in the audience would know the name of the piece, but everyone could tell immediately that this wasn't simple music. David's smile disappeared. His mouth actually fell open a little bit. This was not some amateur playing around. This was serious classical music, and it was being played seriously well. The woman's hands moved across the keys with a kind of fluid grace that takes years to develop. Her left hand played the deep, rolling bass notes while her right hand danced through the melody above. Every note was exactly where it should be, exactly when it should be there. But it wasn't just technically correct. There was something else happening, something that made the hair on the back of people's necks stand up. The music wasn't just being played, it was being felt. Each phrase seemed to carry emotion with it, like the woman was telling a story through the keys. In the audience, people stopped whispering. Conversations that had been happening in hushed tones just stopped completely. Mrs. Patterson, who had been expecting to feel embarrassed for the woman, found herself leaning forward to hear better. Her husband, who usually got bored during classical music performances, couldn't look away from the piano. The piece continued, and it kept getting more complex. Chopin wrote this ballad to be one of his most challenging works. Professional pianists spend months learning to play it properly. The technical demands are enormous, with rapid passages that require incredible finger strength and coordination. But the woman at the piano was handling every challenge like it was the most natural thing in the world. David felt his face getting hot. He looked around the room and saw that every person was completely focused on the performance. Not on him, not on each other, but on this mystery woman who had just made him look like a fool. As the music built to one of its most difficult sections, something remarkable happened with the woman's playing. Her right hand flew across the keys in a passage that most people would need to slow down to play correctly. But she didn't just play the notes, she made them sing. Each rapid scale and arpeggio was perfectly clear, but more than that, they seemed to have their own personality. An older gentleman near the back of the room suddenly straightened up. He was Dr. Williams, who taught music at the local university. His eyes went wide as he listened. He knew this piece well, had heard it played by some of the world's best pianists in concert halls around the globe. But there was something about the way this woman was playing it that seemed familiar. The way she shaped the phrases, the particular way she handled the transitions between sections, even the slight hesitation she added before certain dramatic moments. It all reminded him of something. Someone. But that couldn't be possible. Meanwhile, David was experiencing something he had never felt before in his career. He was being completely upstaged by someone he had intended to embarrass. Worse than that, he was beginning to realize that this woman might actually be better than him. The technical skill was obvious now. But it was more than that. David was a very good pianist, trained at excellent schools, winner of several competitions. He could play this same piece quite well, but listening to this woman play it, he understood that there was a difference between playing music and truly understanding it. Every note she played seemed to have a reason, a purpose. The music wasn't just a series of sounds arranged in a pleasing pattern. It was a conversation, a story being told in a language that went deeper than words. As the piece moved into its middle section, the woman's playing became even more expressive. This part of the ballade is gentler, more reflective than the opening. In her hands, it became almost like a lullaby, but a sad one, full of longing for something that was lost or could never be. People in the audience began to feel things they hadn't expected to feel at a charity gala. Mrs. Patterson felt tears forming in her eyes, though she couldn't say exactly why. The businessman next to her found himself thinking about his daughter, who had wanted to learn piano as a child but never had the time. The woman's face, which had been peaceful when she started, now showed the concentration and passion that the music demanded. Her eyes were still closed, but her entire body was involved in the performance. She swayed slightly with the rhythm, her shoulders rising and falling with the phrases. David found himself studying her technique with the eye of a professional. Her posture was perfect. Straight back, relaxed shoulders, curved fingers. Her hands moved with the kind of efficiency that only comes from years and years of serious practice. This wasn't someone who played piano as a hobby or for fun at parties. This was someone who had spent a significant part of their life dedicated to this instrument. But where had she come from? David knew most of the serious pianists in the area. He performed regularly with the symphony, attended master classes, and was connected to the classical music community. He had never seen this woman before tonight, yet she was playing at a level that suggested she should be well known. As the piece built toward its climactic ending, the woman's playing became more intense. Her hands moved faster. The music became more complex, and yet somehow everything remained perfectly controlled. The final section of Chopin's ballad is like a musical storm, powerful, dramatic, and technically demanding. In the hands of a lesser player, it can sound chaotic or show-offy. But this woman made it sound inevitable, like every note was exactly what needed to happen next. The music built and built, each phrase adding to the emotional intensity, until finally it reached the last thundering chords. When her hands lifted from the keys and the final notes faded away, The silence that followed was different from the silence that had come before. This wasn't the silence of people waiting to see what would happen. This was the silence of people who had just experienced something extraordinary and needed a moment to understand what they had heard. David stood frozen, staring at the woman who had just completely changed everything he thought he knew about this evening. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed to breathe. The woman at the piano kept her hands resting gently on the keys, her eyes still closed like she was holding on to the last echoes of the music. Then, slowly, someone started clapping. It was Dr. Williams, the music professor. His applause wasn't the polite social clapping you usually hear at charity events. This was the kind of clapping that comes from deep appreciation, from someone who truly understands what they just witnessed. One by one, other people joined in. The applause grew louder and more enthusiastic until the entire ballroom was filled with the sound. But even as people clapped, they kept looking at each other with confused expressions. Everyone was thinking the same thing. Who was this woman? David stood there, his face red with embarrassment and something else he couldn't quite name. As a professional musician, he knew good playing when he heard it. What he had just witnessed wasn't just good. It was exceptional. The kind of exceptional that takes decades to develop. The woman finally opened her eyes and looked around the room. For a moment, she seemed surprised by all the attention, like she had forgotten there were other people there. She stood up from the bench slowly and gave a small, graceful bow. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice quiet but clear. Dr. Williams pushed through the crowd toward the piano. His face was pale and his hands were shaking slightly. When he reached the woman, he stared at her for a long moment like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "Excuse me," he said, his voice trembling with excitement or disbelief. "I have to ask you something. That interpretation, the way you played that piece, it reminded me of someone I used to know. Someone very special." The woman looked at him carefully. "Oh?" she said, but there was something guarded in her expression now. "About 20 years ago," Dr. Williams continued, speaking louder now so others could hear, "there was a young pianist who played that exact piece at Carnegie Hall. She was supposed to be the next big thing in classical music. Her name was Catherine Chen, and she played Chopin exactly the way you just did." A murmur went through the crowd. Some of the older guests nodded in recognition. Catherine Chen had been a name people knew back then, at least people who followed classical music. "I was there that night at Carnegie Hall," Dr. Williams went on. "It was supposed to be the beginning of an incredible career. But then," he paused, looking confused. "Then she just disappeared. Nobody knew what happened to her. One day she was on magazine covers, the next day she was gone." The woman at the piano, Catherine, looked down at her hands. The hands that had just created such beautiful music were trembling now. "That was a long time ago," she said quietly. "But it was you, wasn't it?" Dr. Williams pressed. "You're Catherine Chen." The room went completely silent again. Everyone was staring at Catherine, waiting for her answer. David felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. Catherine Chen wasn't just any pianist. She had been famous, really famous. The kind of famous that David dreamed of being. Catherine looked around the room at all the faces watching her. Some looked curious, some looked excited, and some looked confused. She took a deep breath. "Yes," she said finally. "I'm Catherine Chen, or I was anyway." The crowd erupted in whispers. Mrs. Patterson grabbed her husband's arm. "Did you hear that? She's that pianist who disappeared. I remember reading about her in the newspaper years ago." "But what happened to you?" Dr. Williams asked. "You were supposed to tour with the London Symphony. You had recording contracts. Everyone said you were going to be one of the greatest pianists of our generation." Catherine's face changed. The peaceful expression she had worn while playing was gone, replaced by something that looked like old pain. "I had an accident," she said simply. "What kind of accident?" someone in the crowd asked. Catherine held up her right hand and looked at it. To most people, it looked like a normal hand. But if you looked closely, you might notice that two of her fingers were slightly different angles than they should be. "Car accident," she said, 3 weeks before my debut with the London Symphony. A drunk driver ran a red light. She flexed her fingers slowly. The doctor said I was lucky to keep my hand at all. But the nerve damage. I lost the fine motor control I needed for professional performance. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. I spent 2 years in physical therapy, Catherine continued. Learned to play again, but not at the level I needed. Not for concert halls and recording studios. So I stepped away from that world. David felt sick to his stomach. Here was a woman who had achieved everything he dreamed of, and he had tried to humiliate her as a joke. He wanted to disappear into the floor. But you just played beautifully, Mrs. Patterson called out. That was incredible. Catherine smiled, but it was a sad smile. I can still play. Just not for hours at a time like concerts require, and not with the consistency that professional performance demands. Some days are better than others. So what did you do? Dr. Williams asked gently. After the accident, I mean. I teach, Catherine said. Piano lessons for kids in Brooklyn. It's not Carnegie Hall, but she paused and looked around the room. But I get to share music with young people who are just discovering how wonderful it can be. There's something beautiful about that, too. An older woman near the back of the crowd spoke up. My daughter took lessons with a teacher named Catherine in Brooklyn. She always said her teacher was amazing, that she had played in famous places. Was that you? Catherine nodded. Probably. I don't advertise my background. The kids don't need to know about all that. They just need someone who loves music to help them learn. David finally found his voice. Catherine, he said, and his voice cracked a little. I owe you an enormous apology. What I did tonight, asking you to play as a joke. I had no idea who you were, but that doesn't excuse it. Catherine looked at him with an expression that was surprisingly kind. You couldn't have known, she said. And honestly, it felt good to play for an audience again. It's been a very long time since I performed for anyone other than my students. But why didn't you say something when I asked you to play? David asked. You could have told everyone who you were. Catherine was quiet for a moment, thinking about her answer. Because then it would have been about the past, she said finally. About who I used to be, not about the music itself. Tonight, for those few minutes, I got to just be a person playing piano because she loves it. That felt more honest somehow. The crowd was listening to every word. Many people had tears in their eyes. This wasn't the kind of story they expected to hear at a charity gala. Dr. Williams shook his head in amazement. Catherine, you may not play professionally anymore, but what you just did, that was as good as anything I've ever heard in a concert hall. Maybe better because it came from such a genuine place. Catherine looked around the room one more time. All these wealthy, important people were looking at her with respect and admiration. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in 20 years. Thank you, she said. All of you. This has been unexpected. But the evening was far from over. What happened next would surprise everyone even more. As Catherine stood by the piano, something interesting started happening in the crowd. People weren't just clapping anymore. They were talking to each other, sharing memories and stories that her performance had brought back to life. An elderly gentleman with silver hair stepped forward. He looked like he might be in his 70s, dressed in an expensive suit that suggested he was probably one of the charity's major donors. Miss Chen, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being listened to. I don't think you remember me, but I was at your Carnegie Hall debut 20 years ago. I was a music critic for the Times back then. Catherine's eyes widened slightly. Music critics had the power to make or break careers, especially for young artists just starting out. Robert Morrison, the man continued, extending his hand to shake hers. I wrote the review of your performance that night. I still remember it clearly because it was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever heard. I called you a once-in-a-generation talent in my review. Catherine shook his hand, looking both pleased and sad at the same time. I remember that review, she said quietly. It meant everything to me at the time. I had it framed on my wall. Had? Mr. Morrison asked. I took it down after the accident, Catherine admitted. It was too painful to look at. It reminded me of everything I thought I was going to become. Mr. Morrison nodded understandingly. But what you just played tonight? Catherine, you're still that same musician. Maybe even better. There was something in your playing just now that wasn't there 20 years ago. What do you mean? Catherine asked. Experience, Mr. Morrison said simply. Pain, yes, but also wisdom. 20 years ago, you played with incredible technical skill and natural talent. Tonight, you played with your heart. Every note told a story. Dr. Williams, who was still standing nearby, jumped in excitedly. He's absolutely right. Catherine, what happened to you was tragic, but maybe it taught you something about music that you couldn't have learned any other way. Catherine looked confused. I don't understand. A woman in her 40s pushed through the crowd. She had been standing near the back, but now she looked determined to speak. "May I say something?" she asked. When Catherine nodded, the woman continued, "My name is Lisa Rodriguez. I'm a music teacher too, elementary school. But before that I tried to be a professional violinist." She paused, looking nervous about sharing her story with so many strangers. "I never made it. Not because of an accident or anything dramatic. I just wasn't good enough. But you know what? Teaching kids about music has been the most rewarding thing I've ever done. And listening to you play tonight, you put something into that music that I never heard in any concert hall." "What was that?" Catherine asked, genuinely curious. "Love without ego," Lisa said. "Most professional performances, even beautiful ones, have a little bit of showing off in them. The performer wants you to be impressed. But tonight, you played like you were sharing something precious with friends, like the music itself was more important than impressing anyone." Catherine felt tears forming in her eyes. She had never thought about it that way before. Mrs. Patterson stepped closer to the group that was forming around Catherine. "I have to ask you something," she said. "My neighbor's daughter, Jenny, takes piano lessons in Brooklyn with a teacher named Catherine. She's always talking about how wonderful her teacher is, how patient and encouraging. Is that you?" Catherine smiled for the first time since revealing who she was. "Jenny Patterson? Curly red hair? Loves to play movie themes?" Mrs. Patterson's face lit up. "That's her. Oh my goodness, she talks about you constantly. She says you're the best teacher in the world, that you make her believe she can play anything. Jenny is a special student," Catherine said warmly. "She reminds me why I love music. Her enthusiasm is contagious. She's been begging us to let her enter the youth competition at the music conservatory," Mrs. Patterson continued, "but she's been too nervous. She says she's not good enough yet." Catherine's expression changed. "Not good enough? Jenny has incredible natural ability. She just needs confidence." David, who had been listening to all of this, finally spoke up again. He still looked ashamed of his earlier behavior, but there was something else in his expression now. "Catherine," he said, "can I ask you something personal?" Catherine nodded. "Do you miss it? The concert stage, I mean. The professional career you had?" Catherine was quiet for a long moment, thinking about how to answer honestly. "I used to think I missed it every single day," she said finally. "For years I would wake up angry about what I had lost. Angry at the drunk driver, angry at the doctors who couldn't fix me completely, angry at myself for not being strong enough to come back." The room was completely silent, hanging on every word. "But then something changed," Catherine continued. "I started really paying attention to my students. Not just teaching them notes and rhythms, but watching how music affected them, seeing how proud they felt when they finally mastered a piece they'd been working on, watching shy kids become confident through music." She looked around the room at all the faces watching her. "I realized that I had been thinking about music all wrong. I thought it was about being the best, about impressing people, about having a career. But music isn't really about any of those things. It's about connection. It's about sharing something beautiful with other people." Dr. Williams wiped his eyes. He wasn't the only one in the crowd who was getting emotional. "My students don't care that I used to be famous," Catherine went on. "They don't care that I can't play for 3 hours straight anymore. They just care that I help them discover music for themselves. And you know what? That might be more important than any concert I ever could have given." Mr. Morrison, the former music critic, shook his head in amazement. "Catherine, do you realize what you just said? You've discovered something that most professional musicians never figure out. You've learned that music isn't about the performer at all. It's about the music itself and how it connects people. But surely you must feel some regret," someone in the crowd called out. "You could have been world famous. You could have recorded albums, toured internationally. Doesn't part of you wonder what might have been?" Catherine smiled, and this time it wasn't a sad smile. "Of course I wonder sometimes. But here's the thing I've learned. The accident didn't take away my music. It just changed how I share it. Instead of playing for thousands of strangers in concert halls, I get to guide young musicians as they discover their own voices. I get to be there for those magical moments when a student finally understands something they've been struggling with." She looked directly at David. "And tonight, I got to experience something I never expected. I got to play for an audience again, not as Catherine Chen, the famous pianist, but just as someone who loves music. That felt more honest and more satisfying than any professional performance I ever gave." David's face was red, but not from embarrassment anymore. He looked genuinely moved by what Catherine was saying. "Catherine," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I think you've taught me something tonight that I never learned in all my years of professional training." "What's that?" Catherine asked. "That maybe being a great musician isn't about being famous or impressive. Maybe it's about being generous." Catherine smiled at him, and in that smile David could see that she had forgiven him completely for his thoughtless joke. But the evening wasn't over yet. What happened next would surprise everyone, including Catherine herself. Catherine was about to sit back down when something unexpected happened. A young voice called out from the back of the ballroom, "Ms. Catherine, is that really you?" Everyone turned to see where the voice was coming from. Near the entrance to the ballroom, a girl who looked about 12 years old was standing with her parents. She had curly red hair and was wearing a simple blue dress. Her eyes were wide with excitement and disbelief. "Jenny?" Catherine said, her face lighting up with genuine joy. "What are you doing here?" The girl, Jenny Patterson, ran across the ballroom toward her piano teacher, her parents following behind with apologetic smiles. "We just got here," Jenny said breathlessly when she reached Catherine. "Mom forgot her purse in the car and we had to go back for it. But when we walked in, I heard someone playing Chopin, and it sounded just like how you play it, and I told Dad it had to be you. But he said that was impossible because you don't perform anymore. But I knew it was you." She said all of this without taking a breath, the way excited kids do when they have something important to say. Catherine laughed, the first truly happy sound she had made all evening. "You have very good ears, Jenny." "But Ms. Catherine," Jenny said, looking confused, "I thought you said you used to teach piano, not that you used to be famous." "I did used to teach piano," Catherine said gently. "I still do. I'm your piano teacher, remember? The being famous part was a long time ago before I became a teacher." Jenny's father, who had been listening to the conversations around the piano, looked stunned. "Catherine, are you telling me that my daughter's piano teacher is Catherine Chen? The Catherine Chen who was supposed to be the next great classical pianist?" "Was," Catherine emphasized. "A long time ago. But you're still amazing," Jenny protested. "You should hear her play, everyone. She makes the piano sound like it's singing. And she's the nicest teacher ever. She never gets mad when I mess up, and she always finds something good to say about my playing even when I know I'm terrible." The crowd was charming by Jenny's enthusiasm. Here was someone who knew Catherine not as a former celebrity, but as a beloved teacher. "Jenny," Mrs. Patterson said, "why don't you tell everyone about what Ms. Catherine has been helping you with?" Jenny's face got serious. "She's been helping me get ready for the youth competition at the conservatory. I've been practicing this really hard piece by Debussy. Ms. Catherine says I'm ready to enter, but I'm scared because there will be kids there who have been playing longer than me." Catherine knelt down so she was at eye level with her student. "Jenny, what have I told you about being scared?" "That being scared means I care about doing well, and that's a good thing," Jenny recited. "And that the most important thing isn't playing perfectly but playing with heart." "That's right," Catherine said. "And you have more heart in your playing than most adults I know." David, who had been watching this exchange with growing amazement, suddenly had an idea. "Catherine," he said, "would you be willing to play something else tonight? Maybe something you could play with Jenny?" Catherine looked surprised. "I don't know if that's—" "Please, Ms. Catherine," Jenny begged. "I've been practicing that duet you taught me. You know, the one by Mozart?" Catherine looked around the room. All these wealthy, sophisticated people were watching her and her 12-year-old student with warm, encouraging expressions. A few hours ago, she had been sitting alone in the corner, invisible. Now she was the center of attention, not because of her past fame, but because of the connection she had built with a young student. "Do you really think you're ready?" Catherine asked Jenny. "I've been practicing every day just like you taught me," Jenny said confidently. Catherine looked at Jenny's parents. "Is it okay if she plays?" "Are you kidding?" Jenny's father said. "She talks about you constantly. This would make her year." Catherine stood up and looked at the piano, then at Jenny, then at the crowd of people waiting to see what would happen next. "All right," she said finally. "But Jenny, remember what we practiced about stage nerves. Take deep breaths and remember that music is meant to be shared," Jenny said. Grinning, Catherine sat back down at the piano bench and moved over to make room for Jenny. The girl climbed up beside her teacher, her legs barely long enough to reach the pedals. "Ladies and gentlemen," Catherine announced to the crowd, "this is my student Jenny Patterson. She's going to help me play a duet by Mozart. Jenny, are you ready?" Jenny nodded, her face serious with concentration, but her eyes sparkling with excitement. They began to play together. Catherine took the more complex lower part, while Jenny handled the melody in the upper register. It wasn't as technically challenging as the Chopin piece Catherine had played earlier, but there was something magical about watching teacher and student perform together. Jenny made a small mistake about halfway through, but Catherine smoothly covered for her without missing a beat. The girl looked grateful and kept playing with even more confidence. When they finished, the applause was thunderous. But this time, Jenny took a bow alongside her teacher, beaming with pride. "That was incredible," Dr. Williams said. "Jenny, you play beautifully." "Ms. Catherine is the best teacher ever," Jenny said loyally. "She says that everyone has music inside them, they just need help letting it out." Mr. Morrison, the former music critic, stepped forward. "Catherine," he said, "I've been thinking about something while watching you tonight. What you've accomplished as a teacher might be more important than what you lost as a performer." Catherine looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" "You're creating the next generation of musicians," he explained. "That young woman you just played with, she's going to remember this moment for the rest of her life. And all your other students, they're learning not just how to play piano, but how to approach music with love and respect." David nodded enthusiastically. "He's right, Catherine. I've been performing professionally for years, but I'm not sure I've ever inspired anyone the way you've inspired Jenny." Catherine felt overwhelmed by all the praise, but also deeply moved. "Teaching was never my first choice," she admitted. "I fell into it after the accident because I needed to make a living and music was all I knew. But these past few years, Jenny and my other students have taught me as much as I've taught them." "What have they taught you?" someone in the crowd asked. Catherine thought for a moment. "They taught me that music doesn't belong to professional performers. It belongs to everyone. They taught me that the joy of learning something new is just as beautiful as performing something perfectly. And they taught me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is help someone else discover their own voice." She looked around the room one more time. 20 years ago, I thought my life was over when I couldn't perform professionally anymore. Tonight, I realized that maybe it was just beginning." The crowd erupted in applause again, but this time Catherine didn't feel embarrassed or sad. She felt proud. Not of who she used to be, but of who she had become. Jenny grabbed her teacher's hand. "Ms. Catherine, does this mean you might start performing again?" Catherine smiled down at her student. "I don't think I need to perform in concert halls to make music meaningful," she said. "But maybe we could do more duets together." "Really?" Jenny asked, her eyes wide with excitement. "Really," Catherine said. "After all, music is meant to be shared." As the evening wound down and people began to leave, many of them stopped to talk with Catherine and Jenny. Some asked about piano lessons for their own children. Others just wanted to thank Catherine for sharing her story. David was one of the last to approach them. "Catherine," he said, "I owe you more than an apology. You've taught me something about music that I never learned in conservatory." "What's that?" Catherine asked. "That the most beautiful performances come from the heart, not from ambition." Catherine smiled. "Maybe we both learned something tonight." As Catherine and Jenny walked out of the ballroom together, Catherine realized that this evening had changed everything. Not because she had rediscovered her ability to perform, but because she had rediscovered the joy of sharing music with others. Sometimes the most unexpected moments lead to the most important discoveries. And sometimes what seems like an ending is really just a new beginning.